webinar. It's part of a series of webinars dedicated to the informal economy, and the second one is dedicated to the approaches and policies to tackle the informal economy. We have here with us Professor Jacques Charme and Mr. Alessandro Batazzi. Professor Jacques Charme is our research expert. He's an economist, statistician. He was the former director of the Institute of Research for Development in Paris, and since 1975, he has been working on the definition, the measurement of the informal sector or informal economy. He was even involved in 1993 and 2003 in the International Conference of Labor Statisticians that was organized in order to define key concepts like informal sector, informal employment, and informal economy. On these sectors and on how to measure and what are the key indicators for informal economy, we already done one webinar, the first one dedicated to the how to define and measure the informal economy, which is available on our community of practices hosted on Capacity for Dev. And at the end of this webinar, our communication expert, Pierre Berman, will give the details on how to connect to our community of practices. And also we have with us Mr. Alessandro Batazzi. He's working for DG DEFCO in Brussels at the European Commission. He's an Italian expert in the field of employment and decent work, and he is working on the informal economy. And at the moment, his responsibilities is to provide thematic support to colleagues at the European Commission on how to address the challenges and opportunities related to the informal economy. So today we will start addressing the different approaches and policies, and I will start giving the floor to Jacques for the presentation, and then we will have also the presentation of Alessandro. But before starting, maybe Pierre, in 2 minutes, if you could just give to participants some details, because during the presentations, there is the possibility to ask questions on the chat, and this question will be collected by Pierre. So at the end, if we have still time, we can address some key questions, but most of the questions will be then answered after the webinar and will be posted, and Pierre will be giving you all the details. So just a few minutes to give the participants some technical details on how to use this platform. Thank you, Pierre.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for being here and welcome in this second webinar. As Paolo has mentioned, I will be in charge of supporting everyone if you have any technical difficulty, and also to collect all the questions you may have. We already did that in the first webinar, and you can find everything, the questions, the presentation, the material from the first webinar already on our website, the website of the ISF group, and I'm sure you have all the link in the various email we sent you. So there will be, very briefly, regarding your participation in this webinar, there will be 2 presentations by Alessandro and Jacques about the informal economy. During the 2 presentations, you have the opportunity to ask questions using the control panel you have should be on the right of your screen. You can ask questions in the questions box, or you can also ask questions in the chat box. We will be following up both boxes, and we will collect all the questions, and we will make a summary at the end during the question and answer time at the end of the 2 presentations. We may not be able to address all of the questions, and if it's not the case, we will anyway share all the questions which will be asked during the presentation and post them on our website with some tentative answers. And of course, we will be able to continue this debate on the blog. And then during the question time, you will have also the possibility to ask your question verbally. In this case, you should use a feature which is also on the control panel, which is the feature raise your hand. You can see a small hand. In this case, you click this button, and I will then give you the floor and give you the possibility to ask your question. At the end of the webinar, once again, like for the first webinar, we will post everything, presentation, material used, and all the question and answers. Once again, if you have any technical issue, problem of connection, problem for hearing, whatever, you do not hesitate to contact me through the chat room. You have the possibility to ask for help. Okay, I wish you all a good webinar.
Thank you, Pierre, for your explanation. So we have slides prepared by Jacques, and it will be also distributed at the end of the webinar. So hi, Jacques, welcome, and I will give you the floor in order to start discussing what are the key approaches to tackle the informal economy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Paolo. Good morning, everybody. Nice to meet you again after the first webinar. And to start, I would like to remind some of the conclusions and findings of the first webinar on the definitions, the size and growth of the informal economy. You may remember that today, policies and measures addressing the informal economy take place within the recommendation 204, which was unanimously adopted by the 2015 International Labour Conference in Geneva. This recommendation 204 is a balanced set of incentives and coercive obligations, of carrots and sticks, if you prefer, that takes into consideration the diversity and heterogeneity of the informal economy. You remember from the previous presentation that the informal economy is not homogeneous. It is comprised of the informal sector, that is the small economic units, own account workers, informal employers of micro businesses. And in most countries, these economic units and their dependent workers represent from 50% to 75% of total employment in the informal economy. A second component of the informal economy is comprised of the informal employees of formal firms, be they directly contracted, but without any formal rights in terms of social protection, or subcontracted through intermediaries. And the third component is comprised of the informal domestic workers of the households. So policies addressing the informal economy are obviously different for each of these three components. There are various policies for various categories of workers. Depending on countries and regions, focus will be primarily put on the fight against illegal work. This is the case where informal employees of the formal firms are predominant. But in other countries, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia, the promotion transition of micro businesses and their dependent workers will be given more emphasis. As to domestic workers, they require specific measures, provided they are one of the last categories of workers to continue to be ignored by labor laws in some countries. So, to tackle the informal economy, there are several main approaches. There are general or global approaches and sectoral approaches. Among the general approaches, we will distinguish the coercive approach, that is taxation by government, the comprehensive approach, that is upgrading the value chain. This can be used by the governments, but also by development actors, and the approach from within, that is organizing the informal workers. And among the sectoral approaches, we will distinguish three of them, the main. The extension of social protection, technical and vocational skills enhancement, and access to credit. The main focus of transitioning policies is the inclusion of the informal sector. Historically, taxation of the informal economic units was the main goal for governments when they realized the shortfall in revenues from the non-registration of such a huge number of activities. When governments realized that the informal economy was so huge, they thought that it was an important tax base that they should take into account. And this taxation of the informal economy was led under the banner of the fight against unfair competition. These taxation policies have also raised the issue of a renewal of the social contract. Because why the informal sector should pay taxes, whereas at the same time, it doesn't benefit of any public service, education, health, infrastructures, credit, markets. So it means also that it is a matter of building or rebuilding trust and fighting against corruption and cronyism. The incentive approach for informal micro businesses consists in creating an enabling environment for these micro businesses by simplifying the procedures, creating a unique desk for all procedures, providing support services for micro businesses, for example, providing lending of equipments as services, or bulking the provision of raw materials for micro businesses, for purchasing the raw materials, or also bulking the products to be sent to the clients. And of course, it is also a matter of targeting some populations, such as youth, women, and the unemployed. And among these incentive approach, we have to make a special place to taxation as a unique, all-inclusive, presumptive, or synthetic tax. And this is the following point about the coercive approach for informal micro businesses. Taxation by the government. So taxation should take the form of a unique, all-inclusive, presumptive, or synthetic tax, as I said previously. This tax should be based on a clear, objective, and simple characteristics of the activity. For instance, the premises area in square meters, or the electricity consumption, for example. The tax should be delinked from the number of workers hired by the business. It should be collected by a unique institution or department, the tax authorities or the social security funds, and not to be brought to administration by liable persons. This is an important point that I would like to emphasize. In the case of taxation or social contribution, it is not up to the beneficiaries or to the taxpayers to go to the offices, to the administration to pay the tax, but it should be to the tax authorities or social protection funds to come to the beneficiaries to collect the tax or the social contribution. This tax should be inclusive of social contributions. And there are successful examples of this unique tax in Latin America. For instance, the monotax in Argentina, the simplest system in Brazil, and in other countries such as Bolivia or Uruguay and Paraguay. The coercive approach is also dealing with the formal firms and their informal employment. For these formal firms, it is a mix of controls and tax incentives. Preventing formal firms from hiring informal workers or preventing them from falling into or coming back to the informal economy can take the form of improving the registration and matching data available on formal firms. For instance, it is observed in some countries that the number of paid employees declared at the social security funds is different from the number of paid employees declared at the tax authorities or at the statistics authorities. So a second method consists in strengthening and coordinating controls between fiscal, labor, and social security administration, rather than to have a control by each authority. Curative incentives can be the partial or the total amnesties for underreporting firms that formalize. That is, when a firm decides to formalize, she is exempted, the firm is exempted to pay all the penalties that should be used for all the years when the enterprise operated and registered. And for the domestic workers, when they are declared by the households, well, the households can benefit of tax deductions. This is a very successful system initiated in France and extended in other European countries.
Thank you, Jacques, very much. You've just given us the perspective of the government. I mean, how the government tried through taxation to work on the side of the informal economic units, but also on the formal firms in order to reduce and tackle the informal economy. But what about other approaches? I mean, do we have other global approaches for people who work on the other side? I mean, on the grassroots level, not from the government perspective. What are other approaches that we can take into consideration globally?
Yes, of course. As you have understood, the taxation is for governments. But now we have to look at the approaches, whether global or sectoral, that can be implemented by governments, but as well by development actors. So the first of this approach is the comprehensive approach, consisting in upgrading within the value chain. It is comprehensive because it can mobilize several aspects of interventions for tackling the informal economy. As you know, value chain analyses have become more common among development actors, especially the organizations in charge of the implementation of local development projects. The reason for that is that it is not enough to provide capital, inputs, and skills for income-generating activities or for helping or supporting startup enterprises. It is also necessary to ensure markets for the products. So there are two aspects in value chain. The first aspect, and the most well-known, is about the subcontracted home-based workers who need support for accessing more decent work conditions. For these subcontracting home-based workers, it is not a matter of upgrading the value chain, but rather of a matter of improving the condition of works. And we will come back to this about organizing. But it is especially the own account workers and the smallholders who we are interested in here, because they need accessing wider markets and processing the plants or products they grow in order to increase their share of the value-added product in the value chain. Here I would like to mention a good practice in a project implemented by Ghana Planet Finance, a French NGO, which implemented the EU-funded project for an action on women shea nut producers in Ghana. You know that shea nut is the fruit of a tree that is growing in the bush of the Sudano-Sahelian area in sub-Saharan Africa. And poor women are these producers of shea nut. So the objective of the project was to capture a more important additional value in the chain through an increase of the quantities produced by improving the productivity of these poor women, by increasing storage and increasing sales at appropriate times when prices increase, by bundling volumes and by improving the quality of the shea nut collected. This type of strategy usually requires multi-pronged actions, such as organizing in community groups, sensitization, education and training, grant of small loans through microcredit, use of ICTs to access market information and manage operations and transactions at the bottom of the value chain. For instance, these poor women were given micro cell phones on which they received SMS in order to know that the prices were increasing on the international market. So it was time to increase volumes of collections of shea nut. And also, the strategy consisted in building contractual relationships with international buyers and upper actors in the value chain. Because, as you know, shea nut at the upper end of the chain, it is a very expensive cosmetics. Now, let's come to another global approach for tackling the informal economy. It's organizing, the approach from within. Because of their condition of work, these workers are home-based. They work in their own homes or in the owner's homes, or they are mobile, they work in the streets, but outside of firms' premises. They are unable to have opportunities to meet regularly. So for them, it is very difficult to organize. This is why it is important to support them in organizing in order to give them more voice and agency. Traditional pre-existing community-based organization are a good starting point to this aid. And I would like here to mention two very important associations that have been very important in the organization of informal workers. It is SEWA, the Self-Employed Women Association, based in Ahmedabad, India, which was founded in 1970 and was recognized as the very first trade union for informal workers in 1983. And the other organization is WIGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, which was founded in 1997 and which gathers researchers, activists, policymakers, planners, and statisticians in order to support the Association of Informal Workers. And SEWA was at the origin of the adoption of the recommendation, the ILO recommendation on home-based workers and on domestic workers. A good practice in organizing can be found in the struggle of waste pickers in Bogota. In Bogota, the privatization of waste collection was decided, and it threatened the livelihoods of some 15,000 waste pickers in the city because it granted exclusive contracts to private companies. So suddenly, those waste pickers had no more jobs because of this intervention of private companies. So in response to that, the Association of Waste Pickers decided to launch a legal campaign to allow waste pickers to continue collecting and recycling waste. And a landmark victory was obtained and was achieved in 2003 when the Constitutional Court recognized their rights and that the municipal government tendering process had violated their basic rights. So with the help of WIGO and other institutions and associations, the Association of Waste Pickers prepared a proposal for the bid for the tender, which was reactivated thanks to the Constitutional Court. And finally, they obtained a part of the bid and could continue to work in the city. But the struggle still continues because the vested interests in the private sectors have mounted a political campaign to remove the current mayor of Bogota, arguing that the public management of waste collection and the involvement of the waste pickers undermined free competition and therefore was illegal. So you see in this example the importance of organizing, and the support to organizing is a very important issue in tackling the informal economy. So organizing is at the crossroads of most actions toward formalization. It can be used for value chain. It is a key also for gaining visibility and voice and having rights recognized. It is also a key for gaining self-esteem and confidence when facing public authorities. It is a key also for extending social protections and for financing. And in this regard, the social and solidarity economy and social enterprises have recently been given more emphasis for taking the lead in this role of ensuring the transition of the informal economy. Now, let's come to the sectoral approach.
Yeah, thank you, Jacques. Yes, I think you just gave us these three global approaches. Taxation, which, as you said, is the perspective more of the governments, while upgrading value chain and organizing informal workers is also a field for grassroots organization, development actors, of course, also for governments. And I think it's important also to highlight that working on the value chain recognizes the contribution to the economy, the contribution to the GDP of informal workers. And so we recognize the need to do something for people who contribute to the economy of the country. And organizing also informal workers, as you just said, with some examples, it's a way to give them voice and to have decent work, to negotiate fairer price or fair working conditions. After three global approaches that we have seen, taxation, upgrading value chain, and organizing, you said there are other approaches that are sectoral. So what are the sectoral approaches, Jacques, that we can highlight and fields where we can work?
Yes, you remember that we have distinguished a three sectoral approach. The social protection approach, the skills enhancement approach, and the credit approach. So social protection first. You know that with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the universal health coverage and social protection floors are salient in these SDGs. And they are also central for the transition from the informal to the formal economy by definition, because by definition, the informal economy is defined as comprising all workers who do not benefit of any social protection and who do not contribute to social contributions. So there are two options regarding social protection. The first option is that social contributions are made compulsory by the state, and it is up to the state to collect them. Or the second option is that it is voluntary and it is left to the workers or the citizens to decide whether they contribute or not, and it is up to the private sector to offer such services. But in all cases, it is necessary to make sure that the services are effective. I mean that it is useless to convince people to pay social contributions if there are no hospitals or care centers, or if the quality of services are not good, or if they are very expensive in any case. So in the first approach, in the first compulsory option, there are two possibilities. Either the social contributions are included in the unique tax collected by a unique institution. That's the point that we have seen in a previous comment in this conference. And organized informal workers, communities or self-help groups raise awareness among them on the advantages and benefits of social protections and collect contributions through these self-help groups. But in both cases, that is, if the tax is collected by the state or if it is collected through self-help groups, there is a need to sensitize, raise awareness, and incentivize the staff of social security institutions to realize that they are serving the beneficiaries. That is, the staff of social security institutions should not wait for the beneficiaries to come to them and pay their contributions to benefit the benefits, but they should go to them, to the field, and show the interest of being covered by the social security funds. In the second voluntary option, it is necessary to organize informal workers' communities, raise their awareness, and collect contribution through this self-help community-based organization. And in this case, it is necessary to rely on mutual funds to ensure health coverage adapted to the population. Here, a major issue regarding the compulsory option is that beyond the sensitization of the population, the issue is how to ensure that the collection of regular contribution is effective. There are several good practices here that can consist in combining the payment of social contribution with the daily, weekly, or monthly collection of savings in community groups, and use a part of the savings for contributing to professional mutual funds. This is the case of an association, an Italian association, AFSI, in Côte d'Ivoire, acting and implementing EU-funded projects that we will present later in this presentation. Or it is possible to combine the payment of social contribution with the regular payment of a necessary input for the profession, for instance, the seeds, the fertilizers, the gas or the equipment that the professions, for instance, farmers or taxi drivers or hairdressers, etc., need to purchase regularly. And here a good practice is the professional cooperatives implemented by the delegation for the organization of the informal sector in Togo. Another sectoral approach is about the technical and vocational skills enhancement. Informal workers generally lack the theoretical background and the skills that they could have acquired in the TVET formal systems. On the other hand, youth trained in the TVET formal systems lack practical experience acquired on the job, as well as management skills. People having worked in the informal economy and eager to transit to the formal economy struggle to access to the formal recognition of the skills they have acquired. Today, large proportions of the youth who learn a craft on the job are older and above all educated, more educated than their masters or the owners of the workshops. So this means that apprenticeship has changed, and trainees rather than apprentices are more demanding than learning by the eyes. They need that their practice be strengthened by more theoretical knowledge. Consequently, priorities areas for skills development are in recognition and upgrading skills developed in the informal economy. In training informal trainers and masters, upgrading informal apprenticeship schemes so that informal apprentices are not locked in the informal economy, access to higher level skills training for improving in formal workers' performance, Formal informal activity schemes should enable learners to develop and to develop entrepreneurship and startup businesses to come out from poor wages and insecure jobs. Here, I would like to skip to the next good practice because time is running. This good practice refers to skills, the recognition of skills acquired on the job. It was implemented in Uganda by Swiss Contact Germany in a EU-funded project, validation of non-formal and informal training. The proficient acquired skills, the PASS document, was developed and implemented in Uganda in partnership with the Ugandan Association of Private Training Providers and negotiated with Employers Association. The PASS certifies the skills and competencies of an individual in a particular trade and assesses the strengths of the holder as well as his skill gaps. It facilitates the placements among the participating employers' associations. And finally, the last sectoral approach is the most well-known, access to credit and to microcredit in particular. While you know the positive role of microfinance is in enhancing the livelihoods of people dependent on the informal economy is generally well recognized, also some voices have begun to be heard about the risks of over-indebtedness. You remember the headline of the newspaper a few years ago about the number of suicides among the farmers in India because they were unable to reimburse their credit for seeds and fertilizers. But the simple financing, not only microfinance, of the informal micro-entrepreneurs by the banking system also requires to be tackled seriously if the transition to the formal economy is at stake. Microfinance is defined as a set of financial services such as savings, microcredit, insurance, money transfers, adapted to the needs of low-income and poor persons, especially those who do not have bank accounts. Microcredit is not a usual loan in that sense that it is most often combined with other elements. For instance, the borrowed money is accompanied by tips that will help to the persons to the best use of this amount. For instance, how to keep accounts, how to calculate the cost, how to comply with the regulations, how to choose a particular approach or projects to use this amount of money. And here I would like to come back to the good practice of AFSI in Côte d'Ivoire. You remember AFSI, this Italian association in charge of EU-funded projects for the support of handicrafts in Côte d'Ivoire. They created or they reinvigorated traditional self-help groups called the Groups of Savings and Community Solidarity, YESCO, that was inspired from traditional tontines or merry-go-rounds groups. The YESCO are professionally based, for instance, among potters, among hairdressers, among weavers, among carpenters, etc., and so that they can remain at a small scale. and in such a way that everybody can know and trust each other in the group. That is around 20 to 30 members, thus securing the savings. The collection of savings is organized and redistributed under the form of microcredit. So this is very common. It is used for the consumption of goods or equipment or insurance for health coverage. In this sense, the YESCO are a basis for microfinance institutions with the triple function of saving, credit, and insurance. Now, the insurance function is activated by AFSI upon demand of the individual households in order to bound an amount collected at the level of a professional organization of handicrafts that will help constituting a professional mutual funds as the final objective. But in the meantime, the amount is used to pay a contribution to an existing and functioning mutual fund that allows household members benefiting immediately from health coverage. So these are some good practices that I wanted to highlight in my presentation. And of course, time is limited for a presentation of all these good practices. And I would like to invite you to consult, comment, and enrich the RNSF documents that you can find on our ISF website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacques. As Jacques was saying, we are publishing a research volume on the approaches and policies tackling the informal economy. And since we have been working involving many people in our work, because we think that the issues are so complex that we thought we needed to build a community of practices in order to have a feedback and contribution to our work. So we will circulate to participants of this workshop a draft of the volume that we're going to publish. And we really invite you to provide your feedback, your suggestions, and you are most welcome to give us any indication that you might find relevant. And now, after the presentation of Jacques, and thank you again, Jacques, for a very interesting presentation, we have Mr. Alessandro Batazzi. Maybe, yes, we have Mr. Alessandro Batazzi. Welcome back. And as I said in the introduction, he works at the DG DevCo. He's a policy officer responsible for employment, decent work, and international labor standards. We've just seen with Jacques many different approaches, global approaches working on taxation, value chain, organizing, and also sectoral approaches working on the extension of social protection, or the skill enhancement of informal worker, or the support to informal workers to access to credit. And from Alessandro, we might have some hints on the approach of the European Commission and the work that they're doing on the informal employment and decent work. Please, Alessandro.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you again for having me. Just one technical comment. Can you see the presentation?
How to tackle the informal economy? Yes, we see the presentation.
Okay. I'd also like to thank Jacques for his presentation. It was absolutely very complete, insightful, and I think I will touch on a few of those points, and try to complement from my experience, from the DG DevCo experience. The outline of the presentation, as you can see, shows that I will try to establish a link between decent work and informal economy, and show how the conditions of informal workers are absolutely a priority for any type of intervention that we push for. We'll also go over briefly over the employment challenges in the informal economy, something that Jacques already covered, as well as the justifications for intervention, the drivers, and the priorities. And lastly, I'll also cover some examples from one of the projects that we are implementing right now. So just in case some of the participants are not familiar with decent work is a concept that was developed by the ILO in 1999, and a very simple definition, but yet very comprehensive, indicates that decent work is productive work for women and men in conditions of freedom, equality, security, and human dignity. Decent work is based on 4 pillars that cover the 4 different main characteristics of decent work. And as you can see, they cover the range of issues and challenges, but also rights and opportunities that can result from decent work. It covers the aspect that work has to be productive, but also needs to have a fair income, that there needs to be security in the workplace, social protection for workers and for families, the rights of freedom of expression, of collective bargaining, so of organization, as well as equality of opportunity for men and women. Now, decent work is important for the development process because it can support it in 2 main ways. On one hand, increasing the living standards and therefore the range of choices of goods and services that a family, that a household can tap into. And second, it creates those conditions for self-esteem that are important for social, political, and economic cohesion, and as well to promote the dignity of people. Furthermore, there are different transmission channels that decent work can support. Decent work is important, and this is where we established the link with the informal economy, because we know that in many developing countries, in many of our partner countries, there is no social protection, there are no social welfare mechanisms, and therefore people simply cannot afford to be without work. Therefore, the decency of their work, the quality of their work, it becomes of critical importance. The transmission channels resulting from decent work are 3. One, which essentially I covered already, but I think it's important to highlight. There's the income effect, of course. Decent income and earnings mean that there's a higher consumption, a wider range of goods and services, as I mentioned earlier, and it can promote the economic dynamism of a household. There's been empirical data showing that a rising income is often associated with rising household investment in better health education and as well skills development. So improving one's skills can also improve the productivity of an informal enterprise. And lastly, the social cohesion effect, which can improve the growth, the development of a specific context, and of course we reduce social tensions. Now, given that informal employment is so predominant in our partner countries, and the fact that most workers only earn their livelihoods in the informal economy, it's important to identify the challenges that they can face. We mentioned already the poor quality working conditions. Of course, the fact that there are low earnings and on the other hand, high costs and risks, not only in terms of the legality, I think Jacques mentioned this if I'm not mistaken, but sometimes informal workers are seen as illegal workers. There are also occupational safety and health risks, fair terms of employment, lack of access to basic protection in all the different spheres, the labor, legal, and social protection spheres. Lack of organization and worker representation, trade unions. We've seen some cases of trade unions, but there's not that many examples. And also urban marginalization. Sometimes we see that informal workers live and work in areas with limited access to social services and to basic infrastructure services. Now, in terms of the justifications for intervention, we can identify four main justifications. On one hand, if you want, the size of the issue and the fact that the informal economy is the new normal. I will mention this later again, but when we look at employment, it's important to choose the right indicators to measure what we actually want to measure. So if we look, for example, at sub-Saharan Africa, sometimes employment rates are incredibly high. But that employment rate looks at all workers, the ones in the formal and the informal economy. So this hides the size of the informal economy. And given that, as I mentioned already, most workers make their living in the informal economy, it's important to address the issue. Second, the economic potential. There are different barriers to the productivity, to how the informal economy operates. But nonetheless, if put together, you can see that the informal economy still contributes to a large portion of the GDP in many countries, precisely because of the size of the employment force working in the formal economy. Furthermore, contrary to popular belief, if you want, informal workers pay some taxes, whether operating fees, license fees, market rents, or even value-added tax. If the right mix of policies is implemented and these barriers are addressed, the economic potential of the informal economy could flourish and contribute even more to the economic development and growth of a country, and it would be inclusive growth because it would look at all the different sections of the population. Of course, with the informal economy is so big, there are some obvious social costs, and that's again where decent work comes into play, and where the argument to make policies to extend legal and social protection come into place. And lastly, of course, there is a global commitment. We have the SDGs. We have specifically target 8.3 of SDG 8. And there is the ILO recommendation 204 on the gradual transition from the informal to the formal economy. Now, let's look just a second on the key drivers. Let's just highlight a few things. Again, the lack of social protection, the fact that people simply cannot afford to be without work. Inappropriate regulations. Formal regulations are often designed for formal enterprises, larger enterprises, and sometimes the way they are designed is inadequate for the needs and the conditions of micro and small enterprises. So in turn, these enterprises could find it difficult or costly to actually operate formally. Similarly, labor laws and labor regulations can be too rigid, not flexible enough to respond to the way a formal enterprise operates. For example, sometimes in terms of hiring and firing or minimum wages, it can be too rigid for a micro enterprise. Of course, here we should make just a small argument and highlight the fact that this is where the RBA, the rights-based approach, comes in place. So we have rights barriers and right holders, and of course, whenever we talk about hiring and firing or wages, we need to find the right balance. New forms of employment relationships driven by globalization, deregulation, and labor market changes. Trends in technology and trade. With ICT, we've seen that some some workers might be driven to working in informality because of the opportunities offered by new technologies. But at the same time, technology also offers a way to facilitate the formalization, if you want. And migration. Many migrants cross borders through informal channels. And when they arrive in a country of destination, they have an illegal status and they can only work through informal employment. Now we can finally look at the priorities for intervention. First off, create the incentives for registration, for the formalization of these enterprises, but also for workers to operate formally. These can be incentives, can be for registration, can be access to credit, public markets, trainings, as well as, and that's more on the business side, and for informal workers, for example, access to health insurance. And something that I want to highlight, because Jacques mentioned also simplified and progressive taxation. That is critical, absolutely. Second, provide legal and social protection to informal operators. Third, create enabling environments and strengthen support services in order to enhance the earnings and growth potential of informal operators and workers. This includes addressing the risks and costs associated with working in public space to create a more stable and predictable work environment. Just to give a few examples, regulated use of public space, for example. And fourth, facilitate the representation of informal workers and promote participatory rule setting and policy-making processes. This is social dialogue, which is critical. You need to have tripartite mechanisms where workers and employers, including informal ones, are represented in the decision-making processes. SEWA is a great example that Jacques mentioned. There's also HomeNet in Thailand, which facilitated collective negotiation with municipal authorities, and so on. To give a few examples from a project that we have been implementing, the SocioPlus project. This is a technical facility, demand-driven, implemented by Expertise France, Belincosoc, BTC, and FIAT. The way it works is the partner countries and institutions in partner countries, for example, ministries, governments, but also social partners, can send a request for technical expertise on either social protection or employment issues. And the project mobilitates European expertise, so European civil servants, to share their knowledge with them and help partner institutions develop their own responses, their own policies, strategies, depending on the request. It's demand-driven, and there's a high emphasis put on ownership, because obviously there's share of good practice, but then they need to be adapted to the contextual priorities. Three quick examples. On one hand, to highlight some of the issues that were covered in the presentations. On one hand, we have this request in Argentina in 2016, where support was given to local institutions to create to organize a conference on trade unions' strategy to face social vulnerability. De facto, this was designed to improve the representation of informal workers in Argentina, and to highlight which challenges and which policies could be designed to extend basic social services and legal protection. The second example is the development of labor market indicators in Peru in 2017. This is critical. Again, sometimes we look in labor force surveys, we might look at the wrong indicators, and we could end up with a different representation of the reality of the labor market force. In this case, there was a study carried out in Peru to look at the different sectors, the different sections of the labor force, to develop the right indicators, specifically to also look at the informal economy. And lastly, strengthening innovation, entrepreneurship, and formation of informal sector vendors. This again goes to the skills discourse that that was mentioned between my presentation and the one that Jacques gave. The right skills training can be not only an incentive for formalization, but also for to look at strategies to improve the productivity of an informal enterprise. This can improve the decent work conditions, because in the right training, you could also address occupational safety and health issues. And there is empirical data that demonstrates how improving the working conditions, also from an OSH point of view, can lead to higher productivity, but more importantly, to for lack of a better term, to a happier workforce, which means also a healthier workforce in terms of the individual worker and the family as well. Due to time, I think I can skip the key messages. They'll be available on the presentation anyways. But just one thing that I want to highlight, which I think came across, it's important to have a holistic approach. It's important to have a bottom-up as well as a top-down approach. And it's important to look at all the different challenges that are in the labor market, but as well they are external to the labor market. Last two slides on resources. Recently, DEVCO published the Promoting Employment and Decent Work and Development Cooperation Manual. This is a manual that looks at the different concepts and of employment and decent work, and shows the different linkages between everything, between the different characteristics of the labor market, but the externalities as well. And furthermore, I'd like to highlight this one as well. This is more on vocational education and training, how to design vet responses. And there is a specific guidance note that addresses the informal economy and how to design skills training for the informal economy. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Very interesting. Thanks for illustrating your approach to the informal economy, approaching the formal economy from the perspective of the decent work and its 4 pillars that you have highlighted. The material that Alessandro was illustrating, the volume 1 on employment and also the volume on Tibet, will be distributed to participants. And we hope to see sooner the second volume on the practical guidance on how to design policies on how to tackle the informal economy. At this point, I would leave, since we have already talked a lot about the different approaches, I'm sure that our participants might have questions. And Pierre, if you could join us, because I know that you've been collecting questions from the audience, maybe you could highlight a couple of questions for our speakers, for Jacques and Alessandro, and then the rest of them will be answered on our IESF group on capacity for dev. Thank you.
Sure. Actually, the presentations were both very rich. So we got mostly one question from one of the attendees. I would like to thank also all the people who send us messages to tell us that they were very interested in the presentations, all the positive feedback we got. And actually, I would like just to highlight that we will also, at the end, when you leave the webinar, you have an automatic link to give us, with a small survey of a few questions, to give us a feedback, and it will be greatly appreciated. So to get back to the question of one of the participants, he was raising the issue of in-depth, the problematic of over-indebtedness, with the issue of mentioning the issue in Egypt of people being jailed when they are facing issues to repay their loans, and he would like to ask a question regarding how to reconcile this approach, this policy of government, central banks regarding the issue of over-indebtedness and the issue of support to workers, informal workers in the informal economy, and also in relationship with the microfinance institutions.
Okay, so maybe we can start. Maybe Jacques, you could start answering, and then Alessandro, if you want to add something on this point. I think we're talking about indebtedness at two levels: the informal workers, but also maybe the government themselves, because you were talking about the central bank. So, Jacques, if you want to start, please.
Yes, about the process of financialization, that is the generalization of microcredit in many countries. Of course, it has one of the consequences of this process has been that it is not only social enterprises and associations, but also private looking for profit enterprises that have been involved in the provision of microcredit. And this is why in some parts of the world we have ended with over-indebtedness. And so this is why it is important to keep this these microcredit institutions within the solidarity economy, and not to leave it expand in the profit sector. And of course, those poor people, including in Egypt, that are over-indebted and put in jails, should be supported by the organization. So it means that it is important also for the organizing aspect of the informal workers. So this is what I would like to mention at this stage. There is a very important book that has been published about this dark side of microcredit and over-indebtedness. Unfortunately, it is in French, but I will put the reference on the website, the RNSF website, with the questions and answers. Thank you.
Then, Nemat,
maybe Alessandro, you want to add something on this point? No. Okay.
The attendee just would like to specify also that he would like also, maybe he was asking his question with a more focus on the reconciliation of financial inclusion and the issue of indebtedness for micro entrepreneurs, especially women, just to specify his question.
Okay, so maybe Jacques, I mean, the question, sorry, Pierre, if you could repeat, what is the question exactly?
Sure, is how to reconcile financial inclusion and the issue of indebtedness for micro entrepreneurs, especially women.
Oh, this is the point that I raised. Financial inclusion is a good thing if and only if it is supported by organization and organizing the informal workers in order to support them with basic accountancy rules and the tips that accompanied usually the microcredit. And of course, we cannot expect this from the profit-making enterprises in this sector. So this is why financial inclusion is good if it is an aspect of a more holistic policy in support of the informal workers and especially women. And you remember that WIGO is especially focusing women in this case.
Okay, thank you, Jacques. So,
and at world level, we see that microcredit is especially dedicated to women. That is, the proportion of women in the access of microcredit is very high compared to men. But this is another issue because women are less numerous in access to normal credit from the banks because they have no collaterals and so on. There are many issues with this question.
okay, thank you very much. Other questions?
We have also another question from another attendee, but maybe if you want to, Alessandro want maybe to react.
No, I'm good.
No, on this point, I don't think so. Maybe there is another question that is more for Alessandro.
Okay. Then yes, there is another question of one of the attendee regarding. Sorry, I'm going to read it. I'm just discovering it with you. The informal sector economy, which constitutes the majority of most developing countries, needs both macro and micro approaches. The macro approach regards the enabling environment, for example, country legislation that makes it easier and cheaper for medium and small enterprises to license their business. At the micro level, to train these companies in such functional business skills as planning, accounting, better marketing, HR management, etc. So actually, sorry, it was not a question; it was a comment. So
comment, yeah.
About the macro and micro approach regarding the enabling environment for the private sector. This was, I mean, I don't know if you have extra comments with regard to this comment.
I think that many of these things were addressed by Alessandro and Jacques. I don't know if you want to add something, Alessandro or Jacques.
No, it's what we were saying, that you need a holistic approach, both from the top and from the bottom. You need both governments as well as the civil society and social partners to be involved in order to address all the different challenges. So, I agree completely with that, indeed.
I have another question as well regarding the fact that there is an emerging generation in the informal sector in Africa, and also with entrepreneurs, also in the tech sector. What is your, I mean, your vision regarding this this new generation in Africa?
Jacques, do you want to go first, or?
Please.
Sorry?
You can start.
Yes, the demographic growth of Africa, especially of sub-Saharan Africa, is I don't know, some people might refer to it as a challenge, but I think it's an opportunity. And it's a young, vibrant workforce. We have seen that they are adapting to this challenge especially in very innovative ways. There's a lot of different small businesses that are popping up, taking advantage of new technologies. This might not be common knowledge, but the 3G coverage in Africa is quite extensive and it's being used a lot. I'm thinking of a case that I read a while ago about Kenya, how an app that was developed in order to inform the agricultures on the market price of specific goods, for example. I think the huge opportunity comes from the fact that you can use new technologies On one end, to make traditional sectors more appealing. We know that the sector that in theory can absorb the growing labor force in Africa is agriculture. But obviously expectations from the youth are not the ones of working in agriculture. There are new, more attractive sectors, but yet the information communication technologies can also operate in that sense, can improve the productivity of traditional sectors, and can create a service industry around those sectors that can generate more jobs. So we have the direct impact, the indirect, and even the induced, if you want. This gives me the opportunity to highlight once again the importance of indicators to measure all these different aspects, because you can trace easily the direct jobs that will be created, the indirect more or less, but the induced are even harder to address. Lastly, again on new technologies, if I'm not mistaken, in Southeast Asia Plan, which is a very important NGO in terms of especially for women's rights, but they also work a lot on youth employment, and they developed a whole platform for skills training into tourism and in the health sector. And it's been proved to be particularly effective. Also to keep track of workers. After they've completed the training, they continue to be in the system and they update their profile, so you have an idea of what the youth force is doing after they've trained.
Okay.
Thank you, Alessandro. Maybe Jacques, you want to add something on this? Or?
Well, just to say that the ILO survey on transition from education to work in many countries has shown that new entrants in the labor market in Africa especially are as many as 75% in the informal economy. That is, even if they are university leavers, the main entrance in the labor market is through the informal economy. So this is why it is so important to support this young population and to accompany them when while transiting from the informal to the formal economy.
Okay.
Thank you, Jacques. Do you have any other question, Pierre?
I have
or maybe...
two other questions. One directly to Alessandro regarding how to make social protection policies more inclusive, and especially how to involve non-state actors like NGOs in the monitoring and evaluation of these schemes.
Okay. Well, how to make it more inclusive? This is sort of an alibi, but I'm not the social protection expert in my unit, so my response might be incomplete. However, to make it more inclusive, obviously you need to know all the different groups of a society. You need to know what are the needs and what is the existing coverage, and only then you can expand it. And then the second part of the question, Pierre, sorry?
Was how to involve in the monitoring of these schemes, the social protection schemes, let's say the civil societies, the non-state actors.
That's easier to answer. The civil society is critical. It's absolutely vital for development. They have a reach that at the community level that, for example, DEFCO doesn't have, but even I'm thinking UN agencies, and they can absolutely help monitor not only in terms of the distribution, if you want, of social benefits, but also on monitoring working conditions. Sometimes trade unions have difficulties in unionizing, and NGOs and civil societies can help the labor inspectorate and the trade unions to monitor working conditions, and that also has an impact on social protection.
If I may add on this point, we have produced as a research network and support facility a book on this issue, how to extend social protection to informal workers. There's the book that Pierre at the end of this presentation is going to show where to find it. The title is Extending Coverage, Social Protection and the Informal Economy, and it analyzes a lot of aspects, conceptual aspects linked to the issue on how to extend social protection to informal workers, but also we have 3 sections addressing the work at community level, where grassroots organizations are involved, the work on legal and institutional frameworks, where also there is room for work for the civil society organizations. And so I really suggest to go download this. This book is free, and it's a product of our project. So I don't know if there is any more question, or we're going to close. Pierre, what do you think?
I mean, maybe a last one for the room. No, there is a last question regarding informal economy in Europe. We were talking mostly about developing country, about the development world, and the question was what was said, to what extent it also applies to, let's say, the European context, in particular, for example, taking the example of migrants, but also maybe other contexts in which this could apply.
Well, in Europe and in developed countries, as was said during the previous webinar, the characteristics of the informal economy are not exactly the same. And the approach is rather about illegal work that I mentioned in the approaches, in the global approaches. But it is true that migrants can undertake some activities that are similar to on-account work and street vending, etc. But in this case, they are considered as illegal, and so they are subject to coercive policies from the state. So it is not exactly the same kind of policy that are designed to approach these informal workers in Europe. And I suggest that just like for the first webinar, these questions are raised on the ISF website, and we can respond on the website.
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you very much, Jacques and Alessandro, and thanks to all participants to stay with us. And maybe Pierre, you want to introduce the next webinar, which is dedicated exactly to the issue of social protection, and it will be held in September. Please.
Sure. So very briefly, to say that first of all, thank you to all participants to follow us, and some of you already from the previous first webinar. So there will be a third webinar next September. We will confirm the date on our website, and we will. You are all in our mailing list, so we will also share with you the information. But mostly, it's going to be it's likely to be at the end of September. It will be the same format, a 1-hour webinar, and it will address the issue of how to extend social protection to informal workers, and it will be based on our previous work we did. As Paolo was mentioning, a book we prepared as part of our research on social protection in the informal economy. And you have in front of your eyes the cover of the book as well, and you have the link as well if you click on the cover, and you will be able to download this this book, it will the link will redirect you to our website. You will have also the opportunity, if you want, to join our committee of practice of the informal economy, the ISF group. And you can also, by the way, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. You have all the links. And before you leave the webinar, I invite you to fill our short post-webinar survey so that you can give us your feedback on how you appreciated this webinar. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you, Jacques. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us, and see you on the next webinar. Bye. Have a nice day. Bye-bye. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.